As you can see from the slide before you, this lecture concerns immigration between 1880 and 1910. Immigration and immigrants in the city were the backbone of the industrial workforce that made up the vast majority of people in the cities. Now, in addition to foreign immigration, which is what we will discuss here, please keep in mind that that people from the countryside of the United States itself migrated into cities. We're not talking about these folks. We're talking about foreign migration into America. Not all immigrants came to America to work in cities. Many of them went even further and went to the countryside and took the railroads up on their offer of land, and took the federal government up on its offer of land, and took state governments up on their offer of land. Frequently, immigrants, particularly the industrial immigrants of the 1880 to 1910 era, they came to America with the idea of making enough money to make themselves rich people and then returning. Frequently, they did return. Frequently, they stayed. Also, keep in mind that the United States is not the only destination now or then of foreign immigrants. Many nations in the New World had immigration, significant immigration, during this period 1880 to 1910. And for the same reason, there were push factors in Europe and in Asia, and there were pull factors to many nations in the New World. Those push factors tended to be economic or political, that is, repression, and the pull factors tended to be primarily economic. If there were jobs here, people came, and there were plenty of jobs as the economy expanded pretty wildly. The most significant two changes, or I guess qualities, to the immigration of the era of 1880 to 1910 is the sheer number of immigrants that came to the United States. Now, this is, of course, not all of the immigrants that came to the New World from Europe or Asia. These are the people who came specifically to the United States. The second most significant quality is that the origins of these immigrants changed. From the 1840s till about 1880 or 1890, most of the immigrants to the United States were Northern and Western Europeans. They were frequently Protestant, sometimes they were Catholic, but they, after a series of struggles, think of the movie Gangs of New York, they ultimately became part of the recognized structure of the United States of America. But certainly from 1900 till about 1914 and even earlier, what we see is a change from these light-skinned immigrants who shared at least some of the culture of the British Isles, whether they were German or Irish or English or even French. They were somehow associated, at least in the popular mind, with some connection to England. This changed. And beginning in the 1880s, we see a dramatic uptick, at least in the Rust Belt, of immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe. They were Catholics and Jews. Many of them were swarthy and dark complected. They could not pass for Northern European, or certainly even if they were Northern European like Scandinavians, they could not pass for anyone related to the English. And so they tended to stick out like sore thumbs, and it made them very vulnerable as a group to the bad kind of publicity and bad recognition and fear and loathing among the native populations. It's interesting to note how immigration patterns developed. This is the same way for pretty much all immigrants into the New World, whether they were English in the 16 and 1700s or whether they are coming today from Central America. Serial immigration is the first of these patterns. A few early arrivals would send back for family members. They would send back for entire villages. These early arrivals tended to be young, intrepid men who frequently were single or recently married, and they wanted to make their way in the world, and they thought that the New World offered them better opportunities than the Old World did. When that did pan out, they did not leave the New World necessarily if they could get their families and then their villages to move over. Now, when you have that kind of serial immigration, you also have concentrations of immigrants in particular physical locations or in particular trades, or frequently in both. This neighborhood concentration allowed the older immigrants to tend to retain their distinct culture. Nevertheless, time after time after time, wave after wave after wave of immigrants show that the children of immigrants who persist, that is, stay in the same place, those children become Americanized. Nevertheless, we see the concentration in neighborhoods of particular kinds of ethnicities and nationalities. For example, in the Lower East Side of Manhattan, there was serial immigration of Eastern European Jews. And so that became a known area of Judaism. Earlier, we saw the Irish move into the Five Points area of New York, which is a little further south than the Lower East Side. But their children became Americanized. And as newer immigrants came in, and older immigrants had been around for a while and been able to accumulate a little money, frequently those older immigrants would take advantage of their wealth and move out of the neighborhood into one of the exurbs that we talked about before. Let's look at a couple of slides showing immigration to the United States. This is a decade by decade immigrant total, and you can see how it climbs pretty steadily. Our period begins about the fifth or sixth bar down. And you can see between 1891 and 1900, there was a drop-off in immigration that corresponded to an economic depression. But then from 1901 to 1910, we see a significant jump in immigration. 1911 and 1920, it tapers off just a little bit. 1921 to 1930, we passed a number of immigration restriction laws in the 1920s that we'll talk about when we get there. And of course, 1931 to 1940, we see a distinct drop-off, and that's because of World War II. And then we see a slow climb until the 1990s, when we're back up to about 9 million immigrants. Not all of these immigrants stayed, but many of them did. Let's look at another graph, the U.S. population by birth. The difference here is in the blue and the whatever other color that is, kind of reddish orange. You can see in 1850 the tremendous difference between the number of foreign-born in the United States and the number of native-born in the United States. By the time you get to 1910, you see a distinct change from 1900 to 1910 in that ratio. Now, that reflects immigrants that came to the United States after 1890. as does the 1920 and 1930 bars. You see that the native population still vastly outnumbered the immigrant born population, but you can see that little bit of an increase between 1910 and 1930, actually between 1900 and 1930, and that is what led to a reaction. We call this reaction the nativist reaction or nativism, and it shares a lot of the same characteristics as racism and othering, that is turning the object of scorn into an other, a not quite human, someone with whom you have no empathy. You keep them at arm's length intellectually and emotionally, and therefore you don't empathize with their struggle. You resent them. This particularly pertains when there is a distinct ability to recognize the other. And I could go on about nativism, but let's look at an example of how it played out. Actually, two examples of how it played out. One of these is the development of various kinds of nativist associations, and the most prominent of these in our period under consideration right now is the American Protective Association. This was founded in Clinton, Iowa in 1887. Now, you might not think about Clinton, Iowa, as being a hotbed of immigration, but we'll look at a map in a minute that'll give you an idea of what the nativists in Iowa feared. Well, it's not just that they started this association as an anti-Catholic secret society, which meant that they were aimed primarily at Irish immigration. And because the Irish were moving to the West and retaining their Catholicism, and Eastern European Catholics were moving down the St. Lawrence into the Great Lakes and spreading through Minnesota and Wisconsin. A lot of these folks were German, but also they were Eastern European, and they were Catholic. And so the American Protective Association's greatest identity was its anti-Catholicism. That's a thing that held this association together. It spread all the way from Detroit to Omaha in just a few years, the first 6 years of its existence, and then it sent tentacles out from coast to coast until 1898, when it suddenly just collapsed under its own weight. And we'll look at a map in just a moment. We also want to talk about the nativism of the Americanization movement. Now, in Americanization, there was a soft side and a hard side, and we see both of them in these four examples that we have here. Americanization movement was the late Gilded Age and Progressive era concept of organizing Americans, white Americans, Anglo-Americans, into associations and into groups that would focus on doing good. And they would interact with the alien communities that they found in order to either discipline those communities or to educate those communities. And it's the difference in educating in Americanism or disciplining those communities that separates the soft side of the Americanization movement from the hard side of the Americanization movement. Public schools were part of Americanization. That is the idea that there's a lot of different things that went into public schools, but the public school movement that really took off after 1900 incorporated many of the Americanization ideas. One was that the public school would force the parochial school out of business. And if it didn't do it commercially, then the harder edge of the Americanization movement would make sure that laws were passed that damaged parochial schools. This is particularly anti-Catholicism. Sometimes the curriculum of public schools was shaped by Americanization. The reason that you study American history stems from the Americanization movement. The reason that we have English classes stems from the Americanization movement. Learning how to be an American. When I was in school, we had civics classes teaching us how to act in the body politic. And I don't know if you had civics classes or not. The settlement house movement was not only a charitable mechanism as well as a way that women who had been educated and decided not to marry could have an occupation, but it also, in many cases like Hull House, set up at least some programs to help educate foreign nationals in how to be American. They had English classes, they had civics classes, they had history classes. They got people on the road to gaining their citizenship if they wanted to do that. And at the same time, they attempted to educate foreign women in how to do things, how to keep house, and how to cook the quote-unquote American way, whatever that was, primarily the New England way. We see the rise of, particularly after 1900, of patriotic and heritage associations that were designed to ensure that people could identify themselves as true quote-unquote Americans because of the longevity of their families stretching back to before the influx of large numbers of non-Anglo, non-English immigrants into the United States. So the Daughters of the American Revolution, the Sons of the American Revolution are a couple of these patriotic and heritage associations. Then we see an absolute manifestation of the hard edge of Americanization, and that is the growth after 1915 of the Ku Klux Klan. Often today we think of the Klan as being a white supremacist movement. That's based primarily on our understanding of the first Klan after 1865 and of the third Klan that arose at the same time as the Civil Rights Movement. But there was a second Klan, and that began as a white supremacist movement, but because of some marketing, quite literally, after 1915, the center of the movement of the Klan changed from Georgia to Indiana, and it took on a great deal of anti-Catholic and anti-Jewish rather than anti-Black sentiment, and began propagating those nostrums, anti-Catholicism and anti-Judaism. The Southerners still maintained their the white Southerners still maintained their anti-Black focus, but there were a lot of other things going on in that second Klan. We'll talk a lot more about that in a later lecture. I want to show you one more slide. This is an image that I believe is in your book, and I want you to note Iowa right here. If you look at the very dark brown areas north of Iowa, and look at the light brown areas north of Iowa, and look at the light green areas in Iowa and the darker green areas in Iowa, it makes a little bit of sense as to why Iowa became the center of the American protective movement. It was being surrounded, or at least bordered to the north, by large numbers of foreign immigrants. Now, this is a 1910 map that shows the foreign-born and mixed parentage of people caught in the 1910, enumerated in the 1910 census. So, but this speaks back to the original immigrants, and you see that once established, they did not move very far. So, yes, Massachusetts, Connecticut, New York had a large number, over 75%, of people whose parents were immigrant rather than native born. You can see that the old Confederacy had very few, less than 5% native born. But this area right here, actually, let me go around here. This whole area, which became the industrial and the upper Midwest farming belt, badly drawn, I admit, was the hotbed of nativist sentiment prior to the 1920s. And with that, we conclude this lecture. Thank you.